Welcome to the Strength and Courage podcast, a podcast focused on helping you lead with strength and courage in every situation you face. The Strength and Courage podcast is hosted by Ben Thomas and Hassan Kibarango. The Strength and Courage podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, Be to the World. Be to the World focuses on bringing fullness of life to the future of every child impacted by war. Stand with the millions of children in countries recovering from war so they can receive a transformative education. Start your journey as a Be to the World ambassador by making a monthly donation at www.betotheworld.org/donate. And now to Ben and Hassan for today's episode.
Well, welcome to episode 8 of the Strength and Courage Leadership Podcast. Today, it's my joy to be able to interview Hassan on the topic of emotional intelligence. Hassan, I first came across this topic in 2006 when I was living in India. And the organization I was with really started to get behind EQ, or emotional intelligence. And I remember having a call with a lady who was breaking down my own emotional intelligence score. And I remember thinking, this sounds so quirky and so weird. What is this?
Yeah.
So really looking forward to you breaking down the idea of emotional intelligence for our listeners and the role that that's played in your life as you help leaders grow. So we're so glad you're with us today. And Hassan, let's dive in, shall we?
Sure.
Yeah, so Hassan, I find this topic of emotional intelligence really beneficial since that moment in 2006. And I see it in different moments of leadership in my life and in other leaders' lives as well. But for those that are unfamiliar with the idea of emotional intelligence, would you just give us your definition of what emotional intelligence is?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Ben. Just like you, my first encounter with emotional intelligence must have been about 10 years ago. So that's around 2009 when I started reading up on my own leadership and trying to improve my own leadership. And it's one of those, once you start learning about it and applying it, you realize how far back you are in the area of leading with emotions and being able to manage your emotions and others. The University of Glasgow mentioned that as humans we have 4 primary emotions. We have gladness, that's when we're happy and excited and joyful. We get mad, this is where we get angry and offended, and we also deal with sadness that comes with loss or sometimes regret. And then finally, being scared and fearful, fearful of the uncertain, fearful of the unknown. So those are the 4 primary emotions. And before we define it, I'd like to make mention of a gentleman called Dale Carnegie. He was a public speaker, and he was into leadership development. And he said that human beings are not just creatures of logic. When you're dealing with them, you need to know, especially as a leader, that you're dealing with creatures of emotions. Yeah. So what is emotional intelligence? There are different definitions there, but the one that I felt resonates and is simpler to grasp is the one by Daniel Goleman. Mm-hmm. Daniel Goleman is the thought leader behind this whole concept of emotional intelligence. He kind of put these 2 words together and came up with the concept around it. And he calls emotional intelligence the capacity to recognize your own feelings and the feelings of others, and also the capacity to motivate and manage your emotions and the emotions of others as well. So there are 2 things here. There's recognition, recognizing your own emotions and being able to manage them, and also being able to recognize the emotions of others and being able to manage those. And this is now where the work begins, because he talks about capacity. It is possible to be a leader, but to have very, very low capacity around emotion and not knowing how to process that, how to even identify it. There are many leaders, such as myself 10 years ago. I had very little capacity I wasn't even aware that I was emotionally unintelligent because I would just have fits of anger and rage. I would treat my workers with very little respect. and I had very low capacity to recognize that in myself, and thereby being able to manage myself and then manage others as well. So that is what I would define emotional intelligence as, and it has been proven through research, and the more people have researched this idea, that great leadership comes with having the capacity to lead emotionally and to serve emotionally, and that is really what sets great leaders from ordinary leaders. It goes beyond performance. It goes beyond having a skill set and being experienced at a certain skill set, but having the ability to be emotionally in tune with yourself and also the people that you work with. And that's a hard task.
Yeah,
it's a hard
absolutely.
task.
And so you mentioned, just for our readers, Daniel Goleman, and that's spelled Goleman. You can YouTube him for a few quick links as well. Are there any resources you would recommend? I remember one book that I read on emotional intelligence, I think was by Travis Bradbury. And yeah, you'd mentioned the University of Glasgow as well. And so if you could be thinking about any resources maybe that we could point the listeners to towards the end of our time.
Sure.
So let me ask you, this idea of emotional intelligence, building resilience. I remember one area that stood out for me was the idea of needing to grow in my self-awareness, in my emotional intelligence. So how do you know if you're emotionally intelligent or not?
Very good question. So what Daniel Goleman, and we'll be going back to him because he really nailed this concept. What he kind of classifies emotional intelligence into 4 areas, but under 2 subsections. The first one, he talks about recognition. And under recognition are 2 parts there. He talks about self-awareness and social awareness. So how you know that you're emotionally intelligent is your ability to be self-aware, to know what are your habitual patterns, to know what are the triggers, the things that trigger you, to either excitement on one side or anger, rage, or even sadness on the other. The ability to know, to fully point out that these are my strengths. I'm in my strength zone. This is how I thrive, and these are my weaknesses. And also, so there's knowing that and accepting it, and then beginning to manage yourself, saying, okay, when I am triggered, this is how I manage the situation. I don't just, have a fit of rage just because somebody has triggered me the wrong way. So it comes with awareness of self, and then so that's the first part. Awareness of self and others. Being aware of others is growing your level of empathy, saying, okay, I need to understand why so and so showed up this way. Why do they look sad today? Just having that sense of heightened awareness towards yourself and others, being able to read emotional cues of other people, the people that you lead, being able to understand the impact of your power and authority as a leader on people, being able to know your level of influence and how it affects people. That is social awareness. So that's the first region. The second one is now management. So recognition is the first part, and then regulation. He calls it regulation, the second part. Really regulating yourself. There has to be a lot of self-control, a lot of emotional balance, growing your adaptability towards people, and then also leading others well, social management, and being able to influence, build teamwork, work on trust, improve your communication, and so on and so forth. So really, in a nutshell, that is how you can recognize that you're emotionally intelligent, by being able to recognize, but also to regulate and manage yourself.
Hassan, I wonder if you can share an example. You alluded to it a little bit with your leadership and how you treated employees in the past, but when did this really show up for you? And give the listeners an example of kind of a moment when you kind of catch yourself and be like, oh, hold on, I'm getting triggered here.
Yeah.
I need to be aware of this situation, or, oh, that guy's coming strong. Wonder what happened. Why is he coming so strong? So if you could, share with us an example from your own life and leadership of where this is played out.
Sure. So, part of how our emotional intelligence is built is through nurture, how we are raised. And I happen to be raised in a family that was broken. And my father died when I was 11, and the gentleman who took over, leadership of the estate was a brother who, for me, was an example of manhood, but also he had some brokenness, just like all of us. So one of the things I caught that was not a good emotion was anger. I'd get angry so easy. So 13 years ago, I started a business here in Kigali. We had just moved into Kigali, and most of the people we hired were inexperienced. And culturally, the culture I grew up in Uganda was a little bit of a fast culture. People are very decisive, and people here are very respectful, and they follow leadership to the T. So that sense of self-initiative, especially for people who are starting off at work, it doesn't come easy. So for me, every time somebody made a mistake once or twice, and I felt like I have told you this is what you need to do, this is how you need to do it, and then the mistake happens again. It used to trigger me into fits of anger. And when I'd get angry, I would raise my voice, and I'd make everyone uncomfortable, until my business partner reached out to me and he said, look, you're a good leader technically, but you need to deal with this thing. So for me, that was the first cue. Because I thought, no, things need to be done. So I was blind. It was a blind spot for me to know that my anger is a reactive emotion towards people not doing things well, was just creating a bad vibe in the organization. So that's when I started looking for ways to improve on my emotion so that I can be able to lead better. And I will tell you, 13 years later, I'm still work in progress, but I've made strides in growing my awareness and not allowing situations to trigger me into a negative emotion. So it's a daily journey that I'm working on till date.
That's great. What a gift your business partner gave to you.
It was
and
quite a
calling
gift.
that out,
Yes.
and how that's helped you grow and be able to help leaders as well. So leaders, if you're listening, as you're listening, there are places you can go to. There's, one of the greatest gifts a leader can do is grow and to be self-aware and to grow in this area. And so we really encourage you to take those steps. Why do you think, Hassan, emotional intelligence is so difficult to attain?
The reason I personally believe it's tough to attain emotional intelligence is because it's not a skill set you learn from school, just like ordinary subjects are taught in school, and it's difficult to measure it because it's internal and it's emotional in nature, and it flows out of people's personalities, right? So my own story and experience is that my nurture, the way I was raised in an environment that did not emotionally nurture me in a balanced way. So I grew up with that deficit, and I had to do a lot of work to unlearn some of those things. I think that's the reason why it becomes a bit difficult, because you have to be very, very intentional in nurturing your children into an emotionally balanced citizen, where you teach respect, you teach honor, where you love them and overload them with love and affection, where you raise them up in a balanced way. And that usually becomes a dividend when they grow up. They're able to be balanced that way. So the reason why I feel it's difficult is there's an area of nurture. So if you grow up and you become a leader and somehow you were not either nurtured well, or even the environments you went through, school or whatever, were not intentional enough in building that, it's like walking with a limp. You're a good leader in terms of your skill set, but then emotionally. And the other thing about personality and also gender, you find that women espouse emotional intelligence more naturally than men, because there's this thing about them that just recognizes others and nurtures others, which is a little bit different from us men. So, and yet you find mostly men in leadership, so it's very, very difficult to place a finger there, because we're not trained for it. We unless you like a parent, I'm aware of it. I know what it's about, and now I'm trying to train my children so they don't have to deal with the things that I had to deal with. So there's an element of nurture there that is a missing gap.
Well, let me follow up on that. We joked before the podcast recording, before Fabrice hit the button, to record. How would Joanne is Hassan's wife, how would she describe your level of emotional intelligence, and what does that look like as your marriage has grown over the years?
I guess we'd have to ask her. I can kind of think.
Can we get Joanne on the phone?
We also talked about the dichotomy of how we apply ourselves very well to emotional intelligence in the workplace as leaders, because you feel these are not my children, I need to lead them well. But then somehow at home, we seem to struggle. I struggle myself to be able to apply emotional intelligence, with the way I love and serve my wife, with the way I love and serve my children. But I have to constantly remind myself that they're picking cues, they're picking habits and behavior from the way I treat their mother. That's for my children, and for my wife, with the way I treat her and the children. So I'm not avoiding the question, but I think she would say I've had some growing up to do. Growing up to do, but I always fail. Even this morning as I was leaving home, we had a very small argument about something I did not do, and I thought I had communicated it. I said, but it's always work in progress. Always work in progress.
Absolutely. And leaders, I share that not to air Joanne and Hassan's dirty laundry, but just to show that emotional intelligence shows up everywhere. It shows up in your leadership. We think about it more in our leadership in our workplace, but it shows up in your leadership of your home. And really, the place it shows up most is in your leadership of yourself.
That's right.
Because the very foundation of emotional intelligence, as Hassan shared, is that of self-awareness. So we have to be constantly thinking, how do we grow in our own self-awareness as leaders in whatever situation that we're placed in. So Hassan, maybe let me lead us in this next question to really help our leaders understand, how can leaders grow in the area of emotional intelligence? What are a few steps that they can take to really move forward in this area?
Thank you. And I'm glad you really talked about self-awareness being the foundation of emotional intelligence. I think we need to become unintentional students of ourselves. So even in growing in our emotional intelligence, we need to kind of divide our lives into two sections. There is self and others, and how you deal with self and others. So we need to grow in self-awareness by asking ourselves certain questions that only you and I have the answer to. Number one is, do you know your triggers? What pushes your buttons? And why? What makes you easily angry or easily agitated? So what pushes your emotional buttons, and why? And it's also important, again, part of emotional intelligence and knowing those triggers and the things that push your buttons is to observe the ripple effects of your emotions. It's part of self-awareness. What are the effects of, when I get angry in a moment, what happens to the environment? What happens to the people I'm leading and the way they do their work? So it's important to always be aware of certain those cues. So there's also an element of stepping back and looking at yourself objectively and saying, if somebody else was giving me feedback concerning the way I dealt with this situation, what would they tell me?
Yeah.
Because you and I know that we are often subjective, right? We always lean alone into our biases, and we feel like we are justified in the way we act. So, and then also ask yourself the questions, why do you do the things that you do? So in becoming students of self and growing emotional intelligence, we have to constantly ask ourselves, why do I do the things the way I do them? And the other thing is revisit your values often. If you have, again, part of growing in your self-awareness and in your leadership, you need to have core values that you live by.
Yeah.
For example, if you live by a value of integrity and you have an emotional breakdown, you need to revisit that value and say, did I act in integrity in this way?
Yeah.
If you live by a value of compassion and you notice that you're out of integrity or out of your values in that area, you need to constantly ask yourself, did I act in a compassionate way in the way I dealt with this? So it is important for us to be students of ourselves. That's how we grow in our emotional intelligence. It's just like growing in anything else.
Yeah.
You put in the time and effort. We have to do that. Then the other one that I find that is very, very key, but it's difficult for leaders, is seeking feedback.
Yeah.
Seeking feedback, especially from the people that you lead. And being vulnerable enough to say, you know what, I'm not perfect. I noticed that there are certain areas I'm trying to work on. Please have an open door with them and say, if you need to come to me concerning such and such, please know that the door is open. So that is self-awareness. Then there's very, very quickly, there is an area of also managing yourself. Okay. We talked about being observant and reflecting on your own emotions. Begin to explore the why and look at the gap between your own perspective and someone else's perspective, and how can you bridge that gap. And also, when you're criticized, how do you react? One of the things that are important is learn not to take immediate offense.
Yeah.
When you're given feedback, when you're criticized. The other thing that in self-management is take control of your own self-talk.
Yes.
Being able to give yourself objective advice and not just subjective advice. So the way we advise ourselves and the self-talk we have in our minds is really, really builds into how well we manage ourselves. Yep. Then finally, on improving self-management is take time to recharge mentally. Usually, most of our negative emotions are perpetuated from situations of stress and too much work and very, very little rest and exercise. So we need to also have a routine to work on ourselves, because those are more like they detox us from negative emotions. So be somebody who has mental rest and also mental exercise, but also physical exercise, because that helps us emotionally as well.
That's great, Hassan. Thanks. And, I'd love to come back in a later episode to talk about that mental rest. I was just coming off of a week at Praxis, and, they introduce you to their rule of life for entrepreneurs. Wow. And they would say the single biggest part of the rule of life for them that they see that provides the most benefit is the idea of Sabbath. And I'm a huge believer in Sabbath.
Yes.
I believe that cuts across every industry.
Oh, yes.
And would love for us to dive in deep to the idea of Sabbath on one of our episodes, because I've seen that at play in every aspect of leadership. If you're constantly going, our bodies are not meant to be designed in that way. We're designed for a cycle of rest. So for our listeners that are listening out there, for our leaders that are listening out there, I want to point you to a free emotional intelligence test that's done by the Global Leadership Foundation. And it's based on Daniel Goleman's 4 quadrant areas. And if you just type in EQ test, it typically is the first 1 or 2 that pops up, but it's the one done by the Global Leadership Foundation. It would be a real easy resource for you to kind of just get a baseline to see where you might be in this area of emotional intelligence. So maybe Hassan, as we kind of bring this to a close, let me ask you, how does this idea of emotional intelligence connect with strength and courage?
Good question. And it's important for us to constantly tether our podcasts to strength and courage, because that is the ideal that we're trying to build, and or at least the idea that we are proposing to leaders. I believe that to lead with strength and courage requires a whole lot of emotional intelligence, because in there lies the idea of empathy. It takes strength to be able to see others, but also the courage to confront things that you need to confront, but to do it lovingly.
Yeah.
And we talked about this idea of courage and strength not being macho and not being, not the traditional sense of strength. It takes courage and strength to listen, not just with your ears, but to listen with heart. It takes strength and courage to be able to manage conflict well, because effective conflict management comes from a really a good sense of emotional intelligence. So I believe that to espouse leadership with strength and courage it's like hand in glove with emotional intelligence, because you cannot lead with strength and courage when you have a very low capacity of awareness of self and others, and also being able to manage self and manage relationships. So I feel that they go hand in hand, and I don't know if you have any views on how that would apply, strength and courage and emotional intelligence yourself.
Thanks, Hassan. I think I forget which episode number it was, but you asked the question, what is strength and courage not? And I think especially for our listeners leading in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, we have this idea of leadership more like command and control. And I think, even going back to your example with your first business in Rwanda, it was more of a command and control type leadership. But that's not what I find true leadership to really be. Even the best ones that I see command and control have such a high degree of emotional intelligence. They know how their troops are doing. They know how their employees are doing. They know how their family's doing. They know when to take a break. They know when to push forward. They know when can we get another kilometer out of this group, and when do we need to hold back and rest. And so I think that idea of emotional intelligence being tied in with strength and courage is, first painting the picture of what does your true leadership look like.
Wow.
And if your true leadership really is based on love, service, thinking about how do I sacrifice so that you win, then the idea of emotional intelligence really rises to the top. Because you want to be self-aware of where you are and your needs, but you also want to be socially aware of what is it that the person I'm serving needs as well. So like you said, I think strength and courage and emotional intelligence go hand in hand. And I would encourage all of our listeners to take a next step in this area to really see how can they grow in their own emotional intelligence. I will say for my own journey, since 2006, it's been an intentional journey growing in this area, and it shows up in my marriage, it shows up in how I parent, it shows up in how I lead at work, It shows up in how I care for my parents. There's not one area of my life that's not impacted by emotional intelligence. And so it's well worth the investment and the effort because you really see this playing out. So, Hassan, as we wrap up, any final thoughts that you would share on emotional intelligence?
Yep. This really is to leaders out there, and this is a journey that Ben and I are on leadership. Is the more you grow in leadership, the more you exercise leadership over people, the more you need to grow in emotional intelligence. You cannot be an effective leader if you're not emotionally intelligent. So it starts from saying, what do I need to learn?
Yeah.
What books do I need to read? What counsel do I need to seek? Because this is a very, very key component of effective leadership. And in closing, I'll share just a quote from a gentleman called Warren Bennis. He wrote a book called On Becoming a Leader, which is one of the books I would recommend, because in there he talks about emotional intelligence. He says, in the fields I have studied, emotional intelligence is much more powerful than IQ, which is the logical intelligence, in determining who emerges as a leader. IQ is a threshold competence. That's what he says. You need it. You need the skill set, but it doesn't make you a star. And emotional intelligence can. So the idea here is Warren Bennis is saying, look, you need IQ, we need experience and skill set, but that can only take you so far on the leadership ladder. And one of the resources, a book that I found really, it was a sequel to the book Daniel Goleman wrote on emotional intelligence. He wrote another one called, again, it's titled Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. So I think it's important for us to dig into those resources so that we can grow this virtue of emotional intelligence to build effective servant leadership.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Hassan. So one encouragement I take out of that, I don't believe my IQ is so high.
Yeah.
So if maybe I could build my EQ, I can catch up and go beyond those whose IQ are much greater than mine. So Hassan, thanks so much for sharing your insights today. Listeners, thanks so much for joining us on episode 8 of the Strength and Courage podcast. And we hope that you're enjoying and you would rate and like our episodes. And please do send us questions as you have them. We'd be happy to engage with you as well. We hope that this has been helpful as you grow in your emotional intelligence, as you lead with strength and courage today.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks for joining us today on the Strength and Courage podcast. Please share this episode with your friends and tag us on social media. Ben and Hassan are active across Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. You could follow Ben on Twitter and Instagram at Dr. Ben P. Thomas. You could follow Hassan on Twitter at HKibirango. Send us your questions via Twitter and we'll get back to you. Thanks to our sponsors at Be to the World. Visit www.betotheworld.org/donate to become a Be to the World ambassador today. Until next time, lead with strength and courage, because at least one person in this world needs you too.